I indeed wanted to tell you a little bit about, the art of presenting scientific advice to politicians. It's a big topic, so I will go pretty fast over many points. I hope it's interesting food for thought for you. Maybe the whole message here would be, it's kind of useful to really think it as something you have to study, this relationship between science and policy, and not just trust your gut feeling, but really study it and learn about it, and then find your position, how you want to do it. I think that would be the main message, because it's quite a complex and quite interesting context. So we'll go through first the relationship between science and politics. It's a bit like a couple, if you want. Sometimes it goes well together, and sometimes there's kind of argument or frustration. I will tell you a little bit about the global kind of principle of science advising. How does expertise coming from the scientific side fits in the policy making agenda? Then I'll move a little bit. I will touch from far away a couple of points about formulating scientific advice. Once you know to whom you want to talk and what you want to say, how you're going to say it. But this I'm going to go very fast, because it would take much more longer to go into details. And then of course we'll have some time for discussion and question. Okay, so I came into this science and policy advising thing from my work for the Swiss National Science COVID Task Force, as mentioned by Anna. I worked for their, like, almost all during their activities, and my task was to summarize their policy briefs into one-page lay summaries. And so I did that for 70 policy briefs. I saw a lot of information being presented, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And of course, I learned a lot about the relationship between science and policy during that time, but it was a special time, and we'll go back to that a little bit later. So the relationship between science and politics, there's two parts of it. One is the usual science policy, which means actually the way the politics organize the society so that scientists can work. So it would be typically scientists asking the government, could you please give us money? Could you please let us build a new facility, etc., etc.? Or could you please stress the importance of open access, etc.? And then the policy advising, that's what we're talking about today. It goes a little bit in the other direction, because the politics are asking science, what is that? How? What do we need to know? And the science should not say do, but should say here are the facts. So the relationship is a bit inverted. And we'll talk about the policy advising. So in a way, you might very naively think, okay, I'm a scientist, I know the truth, I'm going to show the evidence, and then it will be translated directly one-to-one in policy. That's absolutely not the way it's going to work, because the politicians and policymakers, the government, they might listen, might. They have to take into account a lot of other voices which come external from the politics, so from the economic, society, international agreements, the budget consideration, all this, that, and also internally. So, what is the party line? What is the agenda? What is the calendar of the legislative agenda? Do they want to help another party get a law through, and in exchange, it's completely different. And basically the evidence you're going to provide will be only one part of many voice, and this you have to really accept it. And at one point there's the policy which kind of integrate all that. That's the democratic way it's done. And something that is quite hard is that usually the useful evidence for policy making is multidisciplinary. So it's not only the biology, it's also the economics, the psychology, etc., etc. Because any problem in a way today is multidisciplinary. And so it is a challenge from the science part to be able to synthesize this multidisciplinary evidence, while people do not necessarily talk the same language. And so it makes it really hard from the science part, this synthesis work. It would be already hard enough if it was just one discipline, but with many disciplines, it's even harder. Okay, so in this science politics relationship, of course, is embedded in society. So you have the population, you have the NGO, the industry, you have the media, and all this kind of exerts different kind of forces. And in a way, if you're interested in this science policy dialogue, you should also be interested in the other kind of dialogues. Uh, so, so talking to the population by outreach, talking to the media, um, etc. In a way, you cannot ignore the rest, because as soon as you're going to interact with politicians, the media is going to take notice probably, and they're going to start interview you. Or the other way around, you might first decide to talk to the media to attract the attention of people in the government so that they go to you, etc. So you have to kind of think a little bit globally, and all this is the art of science communication, of course. Okay, so science advising, in principle, it does work, and there's a lot of structures which are put in place to make it happen. You have in some countries in-house science and services. So in the parliament in Luxembourg, I was in Luxembourg early in this week, they have created a service in the parliament that is there to find evidence to answer parliamentarians' questions. You have also chief scientific advisors in the UK or in the EU. In Switzerland, we don't have that. We're, I think, a bit backwards for that. But then you have, of course, the task force, like we had during the COVID. You have expert groups for state agency. A lot of the so mainly all government agency, the ministries, the federal departments, and they have a good contact with scientists, of course, and this really offers opportunities to work with them. And then closer to universities, of course, you have the academies of sciences, consultancies, etc., etc. So you have a whole spectrum of places which have more or less formal setups to interact with policy policymakers. And here in the middle, I don't know if you see my mouse, in the middle, you have, of course, you have direct meetings with politicians if they invite you to talk to a commission, for instance, but you have the conferences where uh, scientists and industry and politicians meet, and then it's a very good opportunity to have one-on-one meetings with politicians, because often politics goes with people. Or you can join associations which have a foot already in the administration, etc. So this is a typical report from the Federal Office of the Environment about whatever satellite scanning of trees. And when you read the impressum, at one point you have, scientists around there, which were just like accompanying. They were not the lead author, but they were consulted to write this report. And so, of course, this kind of document is really a good way to get to get into the closer to policy making. And these are typically made in the federal offices. So BAG for you, these kind of things. Okay. So I would like to say, usually it works, but of course, during the COVID-19 crisis, it didn't work that well because it was a crisis. There was a lot of tension, and I want to talk a little bit about it because I think we learned a lot during that time. And the problem was, in a way, it was a crisis, meaning it's immense and immediate consequence for any decision people were made, no time, extreme pressure and stress. And it was a kind of ad hoc uh, task force which didn't have so much experience with policy advising. So it didn't work as much as we hoped for. I mean, in Switzerland, but in every country, it was the same story. There was a lot of accusation flying around. So from the scientist part, they were accusing the government not to do enough. Scientists in Switzerland said on Twitter that, well, meeting people at the BAG was like being in North Korea because they don't just whatever, they don't listen to them. Accusation of politician suppressing science. So it was from the scientists a lot of accusation, from the politician equally. Well, some politicians in the parliament wanted to forbid the task force to talk publicly. In a way, the politicians were not happy with their impression that the task force was telling them to do what to do. They wanted recommendation, but not something directive. And the media also were, considering this, well, in a way, we should get the scientists out of the room of politics because they're not helping. And they claim that science has lost the public's trust. And that comes from the COVID crisis. We won't spend too much time here there because it's fortunately in the past. We can forget about it. possibly. But in a way, it's very difficult. This science advising is difficult in times of crisis, and I would add helplessness. So for COVID-19, that's a crisis, but after the climate change or biodiversity collapse, if you wish, it's also a crisis. But I think there's also a feeling of helplessness where people don't really know, don't have the courage to do, don't know what to do, and there it starts to become a little bit tense as well, with desperate scientists who glue themselves on. That was in Bern on the road because they feel that the politicians are not doing enough. Okay, and another difficult topic is what I would call the hot topics or culture wars, which are often related to identity questions. So all the gender, sexual identity, minorities, migration, all this. And actually COVID and climate change became something related to identity, where people were really feeling like a group. And there it's really, really tricky. You have to be careful. I think in your field, it's kind of okay. Maybe with gender medicine, you might sometimes reach topics which are difficult, and it can really go backwards. And it's interesting, this example from the University of Zurich, where sociologists try to explain the leaky pipeline, the fact that you have less and less female scientists the higher up you go in the hierarchy at universities. And from this, it went to an article in the Tagesanzeiger, framing it a little bit more provocative. Then there was open letter from many scientists saying, no, this is wrong, this study is wrong, with accusation against the sociologists that they were not working correctly. And at the end of the day, the University of Zurich just took the article away, and this is not the way it should go, of course. So you have to be really extra careful when you talk about this kind of topics, because at the end of the day, the facts that are here below will get kind of crushed by the opinions and the value system of people, and there won't be any chance to talk about the facts. And worse, the scientists will be attacked. Actually, it's going to be ad hominem attack, saying you are not a good scientist because you didn't say what I wanted to hear. So these are the kind of topic that is difficult, but usually, this is usually you have, which topics are difficult, and in this case, you have just to be extra careful before you say anything. You have to be smart about it. And so, as a nutshell, the relationship between science and politics, it's like a good relationship. It's complicated. So sometimes there's this accusation flying. So science is telling politicians or complaining, well, you're not listening to me. And the politicians are saying, but just stop telling me what to do. That was typically during the COVID crisis. When the topic are politicized, the science brings the findings, and the politicians sometimes do this and say, well, no, you're wrong. Typically, some politicians don't want to see actually the facts for what they are. And of course, in a way, what we want is something a bit better, where there is really, it's like a relationship advice. You ask questions, what are your needs? The scientists should ask the politician, but what do you really need actually? How can I help? Instead of saying, well, this is the truth, and now you should just change the law. And the politicians should also, and usually they do ask, what do you know? What do you know that is of interest for us? All right. So I think it's respect in a way. You have to respect the others, the other party, to make a good collaboration, I think. Now, with all that, after the COVID, we had the impression, as the Guardian, I think, claimed, that the public lost trust in science. Not really. This is a big survey in Europe. Most people, the huge majority of the population, 60%, believe that scientists should intervene in the political debate in order to bring evidence. So I think, despite the COVID, which was kind of a tricky time, people still want scientists to express their voice in the public debate. Not few of them say they don't trust scientists anymore because of conflict of interest with the industry. But this decreased, actually. This kind of negative part here decreased recently. Okay, etc. Okay, good. So that was about the setting, and now a couple of general principle about science advising. in a way, the first thing you really have to accept, because policy advising is an exercise in communication, it's that people never understand exactly what you mean. And like now, I have no idea whether you understand what I'm talking about because we're virtual and I don't see any face apart from Anna. And so for me, it's really hard to have any clue about am I talking in void or not, etc. But in principle, I have to take into account the fact that probably you don't exactly understand what I meant. Here, I give a small example. Let's say these climatologists think about saying that anthropogenic greenhouse gases emission contribute to global warming. Maybe she will formulate it a little bit differently, like saying CO2 emission worsen climate change. Already, it's not exactly the same as what she meant maybe to say. And then the guy they're thinking is already started to think, well, emission by whom? Who are the polluters? Is climate change always bad? Who is she anyway? And so I want to show you really that when you address politician, when you write a policy brief or whatever, you really have to think of what is the context of the person who's going to read you, because we often forget about it and we write for ourselves. So we write a nice document and we think, oh wow, it looks really good. And then we show it to a colleague, and a colleague say, well, I think it's a bit too simple. We should make more references. But that's not the goal. You have to really think about the people you talk to. And so what they will understand from what you say or what you write really depends on who they are, what are their background, what do they know, what is the context, and what is the goal. In principle, they have a goal when they read whatever you write or when they listen to you. It's not like, let's say, student, let's say you're a lecturer at university, you come in the lecture room, you have students, you know that their goals in principle is to listen to you, understand the topic, and pass their exam. It's a very special situation. Usually people are have too many things in their too many things on the table, too many email in their inbox. And if they read you, they have a goal, and you have to understand what it is. In terms of politics, it means what is the goal of the of for the politician to listen to you, and how they perceive you. Of course, do they perceive you as neutral or as ideological or politicized, of course. So you have to really think about who is your audience, and let's say the authorities or the government, and it's very, very, very different. You have to really consider these differences to get out of the habit of talking to colleagues who are like you, because they're not like you. And so they don't produce knowledge like you, but they produce decisions and law. They care about everyone. Usually you care mainly about your peers. They have a short time frame. It's quite local. Politics is much more local than science, of course. And it's at the end of the day, it's consensus based. So it's not necessarily the better argument that wins. It's the argument that convinces most people. And it might convince most people not only because it's the best, but because it fits somehow the agenda, the kind of bargaining things that this party makes with the other one or whatever. And you have to accept that. It's pointless to talk to them with this and saying, well, but we are right. You know, that's the right way to do, because you have to accept the way your the other party ticks. There's different type of knowledge. I think it's kind of clear here. I will skip that one. And in a way, once you're in this game of evidence-based policy, so you're trying to bring your evidence and hoping to influence policy, you have to really think a little bit, okay, how will this take place? Instead of just producing yet another policy brief, try to think a little bit, yeah, but why are we doing that? And in a way, before you write the policy brief or before you start a project, you have to really think, you know, what is the goal here of this gathering of evidence, you know, because you're not writing a Wikipedia page, you know, on the topic. You have to understand what is the need from the policy side. Why would they need to know more about your topic or whatever? And so in a way, it's a question of aligning the intent. Your intent is to talk about your work or to synthesize your domain of expertise. And the intent of the reader or the policymaker is to get precise information to influence a precise step in the policy making, a new law, a new discussion, just argument for a campaign or something. You have to understand that. Then you have to understand who should be who should be involved in this, because you're not the only one. Probably it's not only the science that talks. Probably there is also whatever hospitals and administrator that could be interested, etc. You have to be clear about, you know, what is expect, what is the product you want to do, etc., etc. All right. So here it's a bit of a complicated graph where I'm trying to show you a little bit the kind of different type of uh, of of type of policy making steps, and then you have to fit a little bit your evidence there. So so early is left, and late in the policy making process is right, and usually you go from general to targeted. So, and here left here, this big block is the agenda setting where politicians might say, well, this is an important topic here. I think education, other migration, it's important. And there, in a way, what they would maybe appreciate from the science is something called like systems knowledge. Like, well, you can describe all the factors and aspects of migration or education. It's just like a global thing where you try to describe as many as well as possible the complex system that they want to study. And then once they move to policy formulation, so they have a bit of an idea what they want to do, but they're not really sure, then in a way you would need to bring something like called target knowledge, saying, well, if we want to improve whatever gender equality, then I think we could do it like this, like this. You start to discussing a little bit broad policy options. And then they move to policy implementation. Then really, how does, in details, once we've decided to make campaigns or to have new apps that make you recall to be sustainable, whatever, how do we really do it? What's the best way to do it? And then it's a very specific knowledge. And then at the end, at one point, they might evaluate the policy and you have to evaluate it. All right. So you have to think a little bit about, where do I fit in there with my knowledge? Okay. And so here early there, it could be scanning. Like, you just have to say, look, I've heard at the Harvard University, they're finding a new way to mix CRISPR and AI and crypto thing, and this will change everything in the public health. Okay, nobody had heard about it, but you want to kind of raise awareness about a new tool, a new problem, a new whatever. And then you move on to okay, what kind of option are they? If we want to have a definite outcomes, we want to decrease whatever hospital-borne infections, then what are the options? What are the possible policy which could do? All right. And I think I favor that scientists kind of try to be neutral and bring different options instead of saying, well, I tell you what the best option is. I think it's more helpful. Yeah, sometimes maybe it doesn't make sense because you really know that's the best option, but I think it's the most neutral and fair way to describe the evidence coming from science, I think. All right, so at the end of the day, you have to understand how politics works in Switzerland at one point if you want to be more effective. So that's from the parliament, how the law is made. It could be an impulse of the Federal Council or the parliament, and then you have consultation and it goes there. And in a way, you have to understand a bit, for instance, if you know that a law is in preparation, then you have to make the effort to try to understand where is it? Is it still at the commission level? And then maybe you have to try to get in touch with the parliamentarians who belong to the parliamentary commission. Or maybe it's already at the referendum stage because people are not happy, and then you will maybe have to talk to the people doing the referendum, which is very political. Or you have at one point you have to try to understand, to get a feeling about how politics works, to make sure that what you bring is at the right time and at the right place. And here it's for the national parliament, but of course you should absolutely not neglect local politics. I think people tend to forget about them, but I think it's a mistake because you have exactly the same departments at the cantonal level where they have also expert and they might have less access to scientific expertise. They might have, and so maybe they're happier to have a local scientist coming and saying, well, actually, I know about that. I know about this topic and we can work together. Okay, we're making good progress. So at one point, I would say, a bit like a headmaster, teacher, do your homework. So think about what kind of knowledge you can bring and what kind of knowledge is desired. And it's not necessarily the same. Uh, I think all of you, where you're working, probably everything you do is probably interesting for policymakers. I think you're not, quantum physicists or, historians working about middle-aged churches. I think it's kind of clear that what you do can be of interest, but you can still try to align it the best you can with what you evaluate as the kind of knowledge that is desired. And then try to find out at which stage the lawmaking process is. I mean, is it maybe in this canton this is happening, maybe in other canton they're late and they will talk about that later. Maybe the Latin Switzerland is doing something. Maybe there's a new strategy being developed at the Federal Council. Try to have a feeling a little bit where we are. And then try to find out who wants to listen to you and who can listen to you. It's organizations, of course, it's the stakeholders. That's a big communication strategy part where you would have to think, okay, how do I make sure that, let's say, my policy brief reaches the people who should be reached? And this is really difficult, and it's difficult work to do. And in principle, I hope you can do that. Maybe you have support from communication departments, or I don't know who can help you really think about it, because to produce a policy brief and to put it on the website and that's it, well, yeah, okay, you can still hope that some politician, some government official will happen to Google and find a way to your website, but it's probably you need social media, emailing, and you have to think about all that in principle if you want your research to be more effective and impactful. Now, usually, if you have something to say, especially I think in your crowd, probably you have partners, outside of academia, hospital things, and I think you probably have people within your projects that are already connected to the government, the agencies, and the policymaking world or NGOs, and then you can tap on, on their networks to make sure that the information gets spread. But maybe you shouldn't just hope and say, oh well, they'll do that. Maybe you still have to discuss that with them and see, okay, can I help you? Can we work together to do that? All right. And now the last part, and yeah, last part. We could also have questions now, but now we leave the question for the end, right? Okay, the last part is formulating scientific advice. Here, I'm just going to tell a couple of things because it's really, if you really want to do it better, you really have to take time to make exercises and to improve it. So here is just a couple of ideas. Of course, that's the summary of the problem. So can you come back with that 3-year study summarized in 6 bullet points in PowerPoint, please? And of course, that's harsh, but that's true. That's a little bit the task here is to summarize your PhD thesis in 3 years, 3 years work or 4, and you have to summarize it. And I would not say, in bullet points. I would say you have to summarize it in a kind of fractal way, like Russian puppets, where you always have something smaller. So from your 200 pages, of course, you have the abstract, but in between, probably you would have like maybe the introduction or something which summarize, let's say, in 10 or 20 pages, your 300 pages PhD thesis. And then from this 10, 20 pages long document, you want, maybe you can write it as a policy brief. You want to summarize it as an executive summary that is on half a page. And then you want to summarize this executive summary into 3 bullet points for your LinkedIn post or for your the lead of the policy brief, the title. So you really have to think always, what is the bottom line? What is the key message? And that forces you to really have a better, I think, understanding of what you really did. Because sometimes we read policy brief and I'm like, what's the point? What's the take-home message here? And I have like 20-page documents, and I would have to read every 20 pages to understand what really the bottom line was. And this you cannot do. You cannot expect politicians or anybody in this world, apart from students maybe, to read just the whole thing. Nobody has time to do that. You have to provide them with the summary that makes your message clear. And then once they know that, they know where they're going and they can put their backpack and then start reading your stuff because they know where they're going. All right. It's a little bit like, you come to Switzerland, and I tell you, we're going to climb a mountain, but you don't know which mountain, you don't know how long it's going to take. You're not really happy when we start hiking and you have no idea where we're going. So the idea is that I tell you, beforehand, okay, we're going to go to Zermatt, we're going to take the cable car, we're going to hike 2 hours, we're going to make a break there, and it's going to be beautiful. And then you know why you're doing that. Okay. So before you start doing your work, understand again what is asked of you, what is the context, when is the deadline, who will review and validate the document. That could be typically if really government agency ask you to make a report, which I think is a bit different here. You do a lot of push, you produce yourself your policy briefs. And anyway, at one point, it could be interesting to rediscuss the scope to make sure that you have an understanding of what, for instance, is asked of you. Here it's really in the case where somebody asks you, can you tell me about whatever? And I think it's better to make this alignment of intent here to rediscuss the scope beforehand, before you start making a literature review, which is going to take you a week. And maybe it's useless because they don't want that. They don't want the background. They're not interested in the background. They just want to know the 3 new development and whatever. Okay. Then a question is a little bit about, try to estimate maybe quickly how much evidence can be found. Is there evidence if people ask you to summarize the current scientific knowledge on a specific question, how are you going to select it? I personally think it's important to show, in a clear way the different fields of certainty. I think you should make the distinction between a study in 5 mice and a WHO report synthesizing 20 systematic reviews. I think it's not the same, and I think one should be transparent about that. Although I think most policy, let's say parliamentarian, policymaker, they don't care. Politicians, they don't care about that. So why do the effort? But if you talk to people in government agency, they care about this kind of stuff. And then if you have to evaluate the impact of different intervention, it's hard to evaluate, to predict the future. So how can you explain the modeling you're going to do? And then I would say, try to be systematic and try to discuss in a systematic way all the possible impact. And then you can start to say, well, this one is more rare. I wouldn't expect this to happen too often, but just to be exhaustive. Well, this is all the possible thing that could happen, but literature tends to say that option A, so effect A, B, and C are more common, etc. And then so here it's quite descriptive in a way. The first one is very neutral. You're just describing what you know. It's like a Wikipedia in a way. The second is like more, well, what could happen? But you're not making any policy recommendation here. And then you're moving here towards the policy really recommendation where you say, well, describe possible solutions. I should have put a plural here to achieve particular outcomes. And there it's very, 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 very difficult to do it very scientifically in a way. It's almost never the case that you are able to say, well, science has shown that if you do that, it's going to work. Maybe with medicine, if you have a headache, you take paracetamol. Yeah, okay, I guess you have systematic reviews to show that it works. But if you're dealing with socioeconomical stuff and, addictions and chronic health and linked to whatever you're doing in your life, spending too much time on Facebook, taking the public transport, it's establish really, causality effects is very hard, and even harder when you're talking about intervention, when you say, well, if the state makes advertisement for cycling, then people will be healthier. Good luck to prove that. It's very, very, very difficult to prove that, but you can still, shouldn't prevent you from talking about it. You could still, it looks logical that actually if we promote healthy lifestyle, people will have a healthy lifestyle, but you cannot really say usually that science has demonstrated that. It's very hard to demonstrate effectiveness of interventions. Really, really, really difficult. Sometimes it looks logical, I guess, in the 1950s or 60s, I don't know, when Nixon said, okay, we'll do the war on drugs and we're going to make life hard for drug traffickers, drug dealers, and we're going to win, this health crisis. Maybe it made sense at that time. Right? It's logical. If you put people in prison, they won't sell drugs anymore. Well, didn't work, did it? So here I would say, try to provide, for me, it's the best way to provide option and say, we can do this, and that. And then you can say, look, I'm not a specialist of this, and that. I'm a specialist of this one. And here I can really tell you what I know about that. That would be honest, I think. You can also only talk about the option that you know about, but I think it's less transparent. But again, you have to find your own way here. I cannot say it's a must, because a lot of policy briefs don't do that. They don't discuss so many options. Okay, now in a way there is this tricky thing about, on the one hand you have the head of a scientist and you're supposed to be neutral. Okay, and on the other hand you're putting your foot into policy, and therefore you're moving towards political recommendation. Even if you don't say, I believe the state should do this, even if you say, well, let's just be neutral and I'm just going to state the possible policy choices in a neutral way, well, actually you're not neutral, because just the selection of these policy options, the order in which you put them, it's already a decision which is probably biased and political, even if it's unconscious. So it's very hard to preserve, your scientific neutrality in this business, but I think it's worth to do it because that's what gives you this special authority. You're not perceived as a lobbyist, like somebody working for Novartis or for the Inselgruppe, because they defend very specific interests. You're supposed to defend the interest of the knowledge, kind of. So you have a special place in this democratic context. And the more you move towards the political recommendation, the more normative you are, like this Swiss National Science COVID Task Force, which kind of started saying the government should do this and that. The more you do this, the more risk you have of losing this special stance. So you have to be careful, but you have to decide. I cannot decide for you. You have to decide where you position yourself there. You have now, in a way, if you want to preserve this scientific neutrality here on the left, then you have to be cautious about, stating things that could be perceived as overconfident. Is, will, probably you would have to say might be. Yeah. Be cautious. With sometimes we're inconsistent when we communicate uncertainty. You could say, experts say, and then it looks a bit wishy-washy. We don't really understand. It's a bit derogatory. Why do you say experts say? Why don't you say who? So sometimes we really transmit a lot of. It's a bit like the body language, if you want, a lot of information about your positioning unconsciously. And in a way, here we have to be careful about it. This is a big one, confusion between correlation and causation, because people will do that. They will confuse it. It's really a problem. And you can repeat, it's only an observation, only a correlation, but they will at one point believe it's a causation, and it's not really scientific. The implicit values, you have implicit values like everyone else. I guess you believe that human rights are important, that biodiversity is good. Maybe for some of you that growth is good. It's implicit values, and in a way, I think you should be aware of that when this might change the way you frame things. At the commanding formulation, you should. I think it's I think you should not do that. If you allow me this commanding formulation, I think it's better to say, well, or you can say, if the goal is to reduce traffic pollution, then a realistic option is to do that. You're not telling the government do that. You're saying, well, if you want to do this, I'm telling you should do that. It's already a little bit more, modest in a way. And yeah, blurring the line between what is, scientific knowledge and policy recommendation. This is, of course, you have to be kind of clear when you make the jump, from scientific facts and arguments to, well, therefore we believe, because we're not stupid and we can analyze things, and we believe that the best thing to do would be to do that. But this gap, try to be open with the fact that it's a conclusion that is, it's just common sense, but it's not necessarily proven with a p-value less than 5%. So the correlation is causation is really this problem, okay? That's a causation or correlation. I will jump this one. Let me see. Yeah, I think we can I just say this one because it's again, here we're really at a low level. It's just to give you a feeling about the kind of work you can do if you want to improve your communication. These are typical scientific terms that are understood completely differently outside of academia. If you talk about an anomaly, it's just a statistical thing. But for the public, it's like something probably not really good. It's probably negative. Bias, for you, it's just okay. It's a systematic change. It's not necessarily negative. For the public, it's going to be probably you have conflict of interest or something. If you say error minimization, you're just talking about whatever. It's technical. For the public, it's going to be, you made a mistake. So there's all these kind of things. Have a look at this kind of stuff because it's kind of interesting to see how much we have to consciously get out of our bubble. Okay, so I'm slowly coming to an end with a kind of few take-home messages. Know your limits, recognize the limitation of science advising. You have cognitive bias. It's the way it is. Just be conscious about this and then deal with that. Be aware of the different perception of risks. You probably have your own way of assessing risk. Others have completely different, and they will take completely different decisions while facing similar risks. The framing changed perception a lot. Do you start with the negative and then you go to the positive? Do you start with the positive and then you go to the negative? It's completely different the way people perceive that. So even by saying the same thing, depending on the order where you say them, changes the perception. And you have to accept that your audience might not fully understand what you meant, but that's the way it is. It's life. And that your work might get instrumentalized, of course, because that's policy making. People will maybe say, well, as said in this review, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, no, I didn't say that. But they decided to understand whatever you wrote in that way. And that's life. And it's tough. And then you can correct and you can try to discuss, but you have to accept that it might happen. Maybe just one thing to finish, because I really like this one. It's from a US sociologist, lawmaker, actually, a law scholar, Dan Kent from the 2014. And it's really very interesting because climate change is typical, this stuff where you have the evidence that is clear, it exists, and the Republicans, the states were like, no, it does not exist. And, basically what we would like to have is this, that both Republicans and Democrats think that, climate change is caused by humans and it's bad, In a way, from the scientific perspective, that's what we would like, that also the Republicans would think that. But what he found out is that both of them think that climate scientists believe that. All right, so Republicans, they understood the fact that climate scientists believe climate change is bad, but they've decided to ignore that. It's as simple as that. The Republicans ignore actively what the science says because they don't want to change the habit. So in a way, once you made this discovery, you really have to think whether it's useful to bring more climate scientists to repeat that, because Republicans won't change their mind. And then you have to think completely differently. And that's, I think, that shows really the limit of this, exercise. Bringing evidence, it's fine, but if they don't want to accept it, they won't, because it's political. And so they have a political reason not to listen to the evidence. And then you have to work differently. You have to work with people who are accepted by Republicans, who might give that message, and it's completely different.